Episode 4, Gun-Free Zones and Appealing to Values.
You're listening to Guns Guide to Liberals, the podcast where we explore ideas and techniques that help you break down partisan barriers, build rapport across the aisle, and make a more persuasive case for the Second Amendment. I'm John Houtman.
And I'm Sarah Cade. In this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about some new things we've learned since the last episode. In soft skills, I'll talk about reframing arguments with value-driven language. And John's bad argument of the day is about what both sides get wrong about gun-free zones. John, how's your week going?
Well, first I want to thank you for toughing it out despite being sick with some kind of head cold or chest cold.
Or plague.
Right. Fortunately, it hasn't been lethal yet. And if you could make it through this podcast, more power to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm going to do my best. I'm going to edit out all of the coughing and sniffling, so hopefully it'll still sound pretty decent.
Good. Well, you already sound fine.
Thanks. So, how's your week?
Good. I'm about halfway through reading a book called Uneasy Peace by Patrick Sharkey. It's an account of what he discovered while studying the decline in crime over the past several decades. It talks about the role of community activism and local programs, the effect of violence and trauma on communities and academic performance in students, the effects of investment and gentrification, and what enforcement and incarceration did or did not accomplish, as the case may be. It's extremely interesting so far, and I'm looking forward to talking about it at greater length once I've finished and digested it. How about you?
That sounds really interesting. As far as my week goes, aside from getting over this cold from hell, I learned something kind of cool this week. I found this study about affirming values that really ties in well to what we talked about last week, and it's called Accepting Threatening Information, Self-Affirmation and the Reduction of Defensive Biases. We put a link to it in the show notes. It's from a peer-reviewed journal called Current Directions in Psychological Science, and the study itself is a review of previous studies on persuasion. Want to read us a quick excerpt?
Yeah, I've got it right here. Because the motivation to maintain self-worth can prove powerful, people may resist information that could ultimately improve the quality of their decisions. To the extent that information threatens self-worth, or is presented in a manner that threatens self-worth, people may dismiss, deny, or distort it in a fashion that serves to sustain their personal feelings of adaptiveness and integrity.
That, to me, is super interesting. It ties right into what we were talking about last week with people tending to rewrite their own realities to match their worldview.
Yeah, or to take information which may indicate that they are misunderstanding something and repackage that information in a way that allows them to say they've understood that the entire time, or that their worldview actually includes that in some way, and figure out how to not necessarily deny the veracity of something, but still reject it.
Yeah, people find ways to confirm or disconfirm things that agree with or that threaten their worldview. It's a very natural part of human nature. We all do it. And I know I can think of examples where I've personally done it, and I know all of us have done it at some point. What's really interesting about that study for me is it kind of brings home the point that I've been trying to get across throughout this podcast. And that's that being nice to people is the best way to open their minds. It's like, it's science.
Yeah, I posted a lecture that I found earlier this week on the Guns Guide to Liberals Facebook page, given by a man who worked in the intelligence agency in the FBI. And he spent most of his career converting foreign agents into assets. And pretty much all he ever did was find out what they needed and wanted and offer them a path towards achieving that. He didn't go after their ideology. He didn't talk to them about how much better America is than where they came from. He just found out what it is they wanted to obtain or accomplish, and found a way to make that happen for them.
Yeah, I think that's really similar to what we talked about in the last episode with identifying values. And in this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about how to appeal to those values. So it all kind of ties together. I know One thing that really jumped out at me from reading that study was that defensive bias is there for a reason, and that's to defend your self-integrity or your self-worth. So if you hear information that threatens your worldview, you tend to reject all of that information to protect yourself. But it turns out that if you can draw on alternate sources of self-worth, you're more open to new information. Especially when you get somebody to self-affirm their positive values, like to talk about it themselves, that bolsters their self-image and makes them more open to information they would otherwise find really threatening. And the really cool thing about it is that it works even if the positive values are completely unrelated to the discussion you're having. So like you could totally start out with small talk about their family and have them reflect a little bit about why their family is so important to them and what values surrounding family and relationships they really care about. And that right there will do a lot of work for you. I mean, you don't have to make everything about it about guns.
No, and it's probably better to not lead with the most divisive or challenging topic.
Right.
If you can build rapport over other things, even ones that aren't in the orbit of what you're about to discuss, you can set yourself up for a lot more success.
Yeah, you can really leverage this principle in a lot of different ways. So I hope people will write to us and tell us what worked for them and what they were able to think about and experiment with and use to their own benefit.
That's another really cool thing that's been happening over the past week or two, is getting messages or emails from people who have found themselves in circumstances where the content from this podcast proved useful in a pro-gun context. And I'm very excited to see how frequently that's occurring already this early into the series.
Yeah, that is really cool. We want to hear about that. So please tell us all about what worked for you. We also want to hear what didn't work for you. And maybe we can explore some alternate ways and alternate tactics. So this is interesting stuff. We've got a big discussion going on our Facebook page. So if you're not already following us there, come on over and join the discussion.
Yes, and please share your after-action reports of any encounter you've had in which these tools have been useful.
For sure. In Soft Skills, we'll talk about specific, actionable techniques to help you become a more persuasive communicator.
What would you say you do here?
Well, look, I already told you. I deal with the goddamn customers so the engineers don't have to. I have people skills. I am good at dealing with people. Can't you understand that? What the hell is wrong with you people?
Last week, we covered identifying and validating values. This week, we're going to talk about how to reframe your pro-gun argument to fit someone else's worldview. The goal here is not to lecture or to tell the person what to think. The goal is to express yourself in a way that appeals to their worldview and doesn't trigger instant defensiveness. You want to be positive and inspirational in a way that invites them to follow along.
It's important to tell them what you think in a way that they can relate to, so they can understand your side of this argument. Again, you don't need to change their mind. You just need to show them that there are good people on our side of the debate.
Some general guidelines. When you're talking about your values, you want to phrase it in terms of you and yourself. So make it about you and don't require or presume agreement on their part. You want to take the time to analyze your own values using the skills from episode 3. So find the differences between your policies, your positions, and your values, and really think about what outcomes you want.
Also, be fair and equitable about it. If you're going to ask the other person to be open to you, be equally open yourself.
There's a thing called positive reciprocity. When you do something nice for another person, they tend to repay you with a favor of equal niceness. By acknowledging a person's strengths and good points, you make them more likely to acknowledge yours. When you're ready to talk about your values, lead in gently. For one, start with affirmation. I understand why you feel that way. You really value community and relationships, and I respect that. I completely agree that safer societies and fewer deaths are the goal. And then, some examples here are,
from my point of view,
the way I see it.
One of the things I'm concerned about is,
I would have felt the same way, except I had a personal experience that led me to see it a little bit differently.
your view is valid too. The reason I see it differently is because
It makes sense to feel that way. I look at it from a different point of view because my lived experience has given me this additional context. Now, obviously these examples are a little dry, so you're going to want to take these principles and adapt them to the way you actually talk.
notice that none of these statements shame people for ignorance.
Shame leads to defensiveness, which leads to rejection of threatening information, which leads to the dark side. Instead, they say, you were right to feel that way with the information you had at the time. Let me share my perspective so we can both benefit from the additional context.
Supporting a person's self-worth makes them more open to information that might otherwise threaten their worldview.
Also notice that none of these statements create a power imbalance. You're coming to this exchange as equals. You definitely want to avoid making them feel like they're beneath you, especially if you know more about the topic than they do.
Acknowledging them as a respected equal is not only the right thing to do morally, it's also the most effective way to get your message across.
Contrary to popular belief, you don't need someone to acknowledge your expertise or admit their lack of expertise. It's actually counterproductive in one-on-one conversations. Establishing your authority can be helpful when addressing groups, but we'll get to that in future episodes. For now, we'll just focus on the goal of helping this person understand your perspective and have a positive overall experience with you. Now, the framework.
This is the good part.
Yep, we're going to talk about how to reframe your points in someone else's value structure. This is tricky, so I'm going to cover some theory and guidelines first, and then tie it together with some pro-gun examples. By the end of this, you'll probably start to notice how John's Bad Argument of the Day segment has been using these same framing techniques since the beginning. You can look there for ongoing examples of how to reframe old arguments in different ways.
So, what's step one?
Step one is to familiarize yourself with the language of your opposition. Part of the divide between liberals and conservatives is linguistic. And even when we share common values, we still talk about them differently. One thing that helps is to become as fluent as possible in the language of the other side. And that might mean hanging out more with your liberal friends and asking them about their values. Or it might mean going online and reading some liberal commentary with an eye towards mining for values. You can also read the Pew Research Center opinion polls for some insight into what different parties find important.
You'll start to notice some language themes, a few of which we'll demonstrate in our examples.
Next, using the skills we practiced in the last episode, identify what values are the most important to the person you're talking to. It's a good idea to ask them to reflect on their most deeply held values. For example, you really care about your community. I respect that. How did you come to feel that way? How did you come to realize that was so important to you? Encourage them to reflect, engage, and tell personal stories about why those values are important to them. This bolsters their self-image, which makes it easier for them to hear information they may find threatening. When it's your turn, reframe the debate in their terms as best you can.
If you're talking to a progressive audience, appeals to tradition and history are less likely to resonate.
That's why simply telling them to read the Constitution doesn't work. Appealing to tradition just for tradition's sake just isn't very persuasive. Appeals presented in a modern context can resonate much better.
Try appealing to values like community, empowerment, autonomy, equality, intellectualism, and fairness.
The next thing you'll do is develop an inspirational values statement. And this is something you can do ahead of time or in the moment. It depends on what works best for you. Personally, I like to do it ahead of time because I don't always think quickly on the spot. So your inspirational values statement comes from the heart. It's framed in their language as best you can. It's positive in tone, and it invites them to come along with you, rather than implying your way is the best way.
Here are some examples of values, along with the relevant framing language.
The first value is community. In this example, note the use of we statements to frame the argument collectively instead of I statements that frame it individually.
I agree with you that it's important to work together for a better future. Our society will never be perfect, but we all have a responsibility to address the root causes of violence so that we can live in a safer society that respects the rights of everyone.
Empowerment. Carrying a gun is not for everyone. Some may see it as a sign of fear, but for me, carrying a gun is the result of study and serious reflection on the realities of the world as it is. Understanding the nature of violence, knowing my risks, and understanding my own capabilities makes me feel more confident in myself.
Equality. This quote is from Stephanie Widener of Active Self-Protection. I get to set my boundaries and have at least equal ability to enforce them as you have to run over them.
Autonomy. This is a quote from Annette Evans of The Beauty Behind the Blast. Agency and the power to determine one's own fate is important to me. Hence guns and other tools that prevent one from being merely subject to the whims and protection of one who is stronger or more powerful.
Intellectualism. At first glance, it's clearly apparent that guns are dangerous, but a deeper dive into the data shows us that these risks are contextual. I found that when I started studying firearms, it gave me a much better picture of what the risks and benefits of owning a gun actually are. That knowledge made me feel confident that I could make an informed decision that's right for me.
Fairness. From my perspective, I consider the freedom to make choices about my body and my boundaries to be an issue of essential justice. While I believe the authors meant well, one of the unintended consequences of this policy is that it disempowers people of lower socioeconomic status and prevents them from accessing rights that the rich and privileged can still access easily.
Remember back in episode 2 when we said that most liberals think that the government should have an interest in protecting public health and welfare? Here's where that will come in handy.
So here's a common framework you'll hear. Because gun violence is a threat to public safety, the government has an interest in regulating guns.
You can reframe that as, because the causes of gun violence are so different, the most effective way for the government to protect public safety is to address the root causes of suicide, homicide, domestic violence, and mass killings as separate issues.
Our last example is how to overcome resistance and reframe the actual discussion you're in right in the present moment.
A common frame you might hear is, we'll never agree on this issue.
You can reframe that by saying, it may seem discouraging, but I think the fact that our perspectives are so different is actually our greatest strength. Diversity is part of what makes this country so strong. When we embrace our rich ideological diversity, we have a better chance of finding new ideas and real solutions to the problems we all care about.
But what if you're talking to someone who thinks their framework is the only way to see things?
If you're having trouble getting someone to step back from their framework, you can try directly pointing out that frames exist. Point out your own as well as theirs so they don't feel like you're personally attacking them. Some examples of this are you could say something like, well, gun safety is one frame. That's one way of looking at the issue. Violence reduction is a frame. Root cause mitigation is a frame.
Try to encourage people to step back and observe their framework, and then invite them to observe your framework. You don't need to convince them that yours is better. You just need to show them that there are more options out there.
Out of all the soft skills we've discussed so far, reframing requires the most critical thinking. It's worth taking some time in advance to write down your thoughts. A good way to do this is to list a few of the most common gun control talking points and then write down how you'd reframe each one in a positive way. That'll help you be more prepared, so you're not trying to construct a brand new argument on the fly. Next week, we will switch it up. We're going to take a little break from all the heavy thinking and experiment with some simple, practical exercises that can help you improve your persuasiveness.
In this week's Bad Argument of the Day, we're going to reframe gun-free zones. The discussion surrounding gun-free zones and their implementation is highly emotional. In the wake of a high-profile mass shooting, supporters of gun rights observed that the event occurred at a workplace, or school, or other public venue which was designated as a gun-free zone. And they feel outrage on behalf of the victims who were rendered vulnerable and disempowered from preserving their lives. It appears that those intent on doing harm are identifying gun-free zones as soft targets where they can harm the most people.
From the perspective of the gun control side, the fact that someone can just freely walk into a school, shopping mall, or business with a gun and start shooting is a problem. The fact that guns empower bad people to cause harm so easily seems like an indicator that we should be working harder to ban guns from more places, more strictly, and make guns harder to access or carry in public.
I want to try and tighten up some of the arguments surrounding this topic. I think we're all falling victim to some of the kinds of traps of obviousness which we've talked about previously. We're both missing the bullseye and talking past each other on this issue in several important ways. First is the difference between security and policy. Second is regarding how these attackers pick their targets. And third is why places are usually designated as gun-free zones in the first place. I'm going to establish these three things and then tie them all together at the end. So please stick with me. Security consists of a combination of technologies and behaviors which impede or deter acts of malice. Effective security requires consistent human support. Every door of your office could have badged access control, but that doesn't do anything if employees are holding the door open for people they don't recognize. Your digital assets could be nearly impenetrable from external hacking, but that doesn't do anything if the CEO's login credentials are on a post-it note on their desk. The strength of any security requires that the human surface, as a vector for attack, is small. Employees are empowered to be aware of strangers in the facility, to ask for their ID, to maintain physical access restrictions, and secure their badges and other important information.
Policy, on the other hand, is nothing more than a description of the expected behaviors and the consequences for failing to meet those expectations.
Policy and security need to work together. If employees don't have the knowledge or technical resources to execute the policy, then the security falls short, and it's the responsibility of the employer to empower their staff to engage with the security process. In our previous episode, we discussed the phenomenon of mass shooting with Brian Strasser, a security and threat management expert. In that episode, we discussed new data on mass shootings and put a few important things in perspective.
Pause now and check out that episode if you haven't listened yet.
According to the Violence Project report, most mass shootings occur in or around the workplace. Most mass shooters know the people they're going to attack and have some grievance with their work, boss, or relationship partner. Their target selection process is primarily influenced by that grievance. The gun-free zone policy of that location is largely coincidental to the attack. If we put forward the case that gun-free zones attract mass shooters, we're not framing that argument accurately.
Even when they're not motivated by a specific grievance, in most cases where the shooter has selected a store, mall, or other public place, what makes the target attractive is the concentration of people. The fact that these places are often gun-free zones is mostly incidental.
To be credible and accurate in our disagreement with gun-free zone policies, we need to get the cause and effect in the right order. There are a few reasons that businesses and institutions designate themselves as gun-free zones. First is liability. They just don't want to be on the hook for any incidents resulting in damage or injury, which could be attributed to a permissive firearms policy.
Restrictions on pets other than service animals are kind of like this too. The second is some attempt at security policy. Along the lines of no shoes, no shirt, no service, making a place gun-free gives the property owner an additional way to eject or bar from entry people they think might cause a problem.
Of course, we take issue with the assumption that carrying a gun is a precursor to causing a problem, but different environments and different experiences generate different expectations. Either way, it gives them a rough guide to act. If someone is there with a gun, management doesn't need to wait to discern their intentions before asking them to leave. I've been to places where the sign on the door reads, "No gang colors and no weapons," so that gives me the impression that they at least have some history with a specific kind of issue. Now, if a person is killed or injured in a gun-free zone, when they ordinarily would have been able to provide for their own safety, that is a sin.
People should never be disempowered and then left vulnerable.
And establishing a gun-free zone merely as a policy with no security infrastructure in place is irresponsible. No place is a gun-free zone by declaration alone. It requires that security measures are established which actually result in the area being free of guns. I know that I'm not inclined to respect unenforced policy if my risk of detection is zero, and signs without a security checkpoint command the same respect as a speed limit. A sign isn't a screening process, and those who are posting signs can expect them to be ignored by anyone capable of concealing a pistol.
But only about 7% of the population has a carry permit, and an even smaller percentage carry regularly. So what are the chances that a rare permit holder is going to intersect with an ultra-rare mass shooter?
It happens occasionally, for sure, frequently an off-duty police officer. But is it often enough that we should orient policy towards that?
What if these so-called good guys with guns aren't actually an asset? What if the concerns about liability are well-founded?
So far, we're not aware of any recorded incident in which a civilian responding to a mass shooting either shot or killed the wrong person, impeded the police response, or were mistakenly identified by the police as the shooter. The concern about accidents involving unnecessary gun handling in the workplace is understandable, although that's also an incredibly rare event. So given what we know about security, policy, the nature of mass shootings, and the motivations for making places gun-free zones, where do we get the lever underneath this issue?
How do we shift away from the chanting points of gun-free zones being free fire zones, being the causal factor in target selection, or other tropes which don't move the ball down the field?
I think it goes back to empowering the human element of the security process. For many people, the workplace is where they spend a significant portion of their lives. Thousands of hours each year, our bodies are located in places we don't control. While we're empowered through policy and infrastructure to maintain the security interests of our employers, we place a lot of trust in them to maintain our security interests as well. As of now, it's a fairly one-sided relationship. Balancing that out, I think, is the first step. Beyond the dismal, mandatory, death by PowerPoint active shooter training that employers provide, consisting largely of lockdown procedures or, at best, improvised defense techniques, employees and staff should be empowered to look out for the signs of distress or leakage which appear when a crisis is brewing. Keep an eye on what your coworkers post on social media, care about their day-to-day emotional states, notice when things are different, and notice if things escalate.
As we discussed previously in episode 3.5, there are visible predictive indicators prior to most of these events. And employers should have contingencies and off-ramps where people on the road to crisis can exit and get some support.
A shooting in your workplace or school will be perpetrated against people you know, trust, and even love. And it will be carried out by someone you likely already know. Empower and enable these people to look out for each other, and empower the people you trust and respect with whom you spend the majority of your life to provide for the safety of their bodies. It's responsible and ethical for a workplace which provides no real physical security infrastructure to acknowledge that the bodies of their employees inhabit their facility like a second home. And among these employees are trustworthy and competent human beings with whom the success of the business is entrusted. Given that carry permit holders commit crimes at a rate lower even than the police, ought not there be a mechanism by which the trustworthy and competent people in your workplace are empowered to at least protect the integrity of their own bodies in the location where they spend half of their lives? Businesses, of course, are free to make their own policy determinations, but those should be developed with a real understanding of pros and cons and risk assessment.
And in order to have freedom to make their own policy decisions, businesses should not be forced into one policy or another by law.
Well-being, involvement, community, and individual empowerment are important to the health of the workplace. In terms of prevention and early interdiction, a healthy and supportive workplace will accomplish more than active shooter drills.
Instead of gun control advocates treating policy like security, and instead of gun rights activists chanting about a good guy with a gun, neither of which do anything but preach to their respective choirs, we should frame this issue in terms of not just work-life balance, but work-life value.
Thanks for listening to the Guns Guide to Liberals podcast. Head over to our Facebook page if you want to discuss these topics with us. I should just have a gun over here.
You should.
We should be rolling for all of this.
Well, it is rolling.
Oh, good. Clean up your guns. They're for the podcast, Mom.